Not everyone who seeks light is ready to stand in its blaze. There are those who claim to crave it, the warmth, the hope, the clarity, but when the light shows up raw and unfiltered, they flinch. They turn away, retreating to the familiar safety of shadows. You were that light. Not a flickering candle, timid and fleeting, but a wildfire, radiant, consuming, and unapologetically alive. And in his world of careful shadows and hidden truth, you were a terror. Your presence wasn't a whisper, it was a roar. You didn't slip into his life quietly. You crashed into it, illuminating corners he didn't want to face, corners filled with his insecurities, his lies, and the fragile facade he had built to keep the world and himself from seeing the truth. You were everything he didn't know he needed and everything he secretly feared. And fear? Oh, it's not the kind of fear that comes with monsters or nightmares. It's the kind that comes with change, with truth, with the realization that he'd have to be more to stand beside you. He lived in the shadows, didn't he? A world of half-truths and quiet lies. It was easier that way. Easier to remain unchallenged, to keep his flaws comfortably hidden when no one, not even he, had to confront them. Then you came along, a force of nature, unyielding and unstoppable. You didn't just shine a light on him, you were the light. You walked into his darkness, not timidly, not apologetically, but boldly, as if daring the shadows to fight back. And they couldn't. But he could, or at least he thought he could. You see, people like him don't hate the light because it's too bright. They hate it because it demands something of them. It forces them to see the cracks, the weaknesses, the truths they've spent years running from. Your fire wasn't just beautiful, it was dangerous. It didn't just illuminate his world. It threatened to burn it down, taking every lie he had ever told himself with it. You were in his comfort zone. You were his reckoning. Every time you laughed with a freedom he couldn't comprehend. Every time you spoke with a conviction he didn't possess, it was a reminder of everything he wasn't. You made him question the life he thought he wanted. You made him realize how small he had kept himself. And that scared him. Because it wasn't just about loving you. It was about rising to meet you. It was about standing in your light without being consumed by it. And he couldn't. And he wouldn't. You gave him something precious. Hope. A glimpse of what life could be like if he dared to step out of the shadows. But hope is a dangerous thing to give to someone who fears change. Instead of holding on to it, he crushed it. Instead of rising, he ran. But don't you dare mistake his retreat for your failure. Don't you dare think his departure means you were too much of the wrong thing. No, he didn't leave because you weren't enough. He left because you were too much. And that's the truth he's too weak to admit. The truth about men like him is simple. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of what you make them see in themselves. There's something about the light, your light, that unsettled him to his core. Not because it burned too bright, but because it threatened to reveal everything he worked so hard to hide. The shadows were his sanctuary, his fortress. In that darkness, he could pretend to be more than he was. But your fire, it was relentless, piercing through every lie, every facade, and every fragile piece of his identity. He wasn't just afraid of losing you. No, that would be too noble. He was afraid of being seen for what he truly was. A man too small, too weak, and too afraid to rise to meet you. He was a man of shadows, wasn't he? Shadows don't demand. Shadows don't challenge. They allow you to exist as you are, unchallenged, stagnant, and unchanging. And for him, that was enough. Or at least it was until you showed up. When your fire illuminated his world, it didn't just reveal the beauty of what could be. It exposed the rot he'd buried beneath years of avoidance and insecurity. He told himself stories, didn't he? Stories about how the world was unfair, how he was misunderstood, how he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. And maybe he even believed them until you came along. 'Cause you're light. It didn't give him the luxury of those lies. It was a mirror showing him every scar, every failure, and every cowardly decision he had ever made. And that was the problem. You didn't just see his potential, you made him see it too. And the truth about potential is, it demands action. It demands growth. But he wasn't ready for that. Growth requires discomfort, and discomfort was something he spent his entire life avoiding. So instead, he chose the shadows. He chose his comfort, and he told himself it was your fault. You see, when men like him are faced with a fire they can't handle, they don't admit defeat. No, they try to extinguish it. He couldn't rise to your level, so he tried to drag you down to his. It started small, didn't it? Little comments, subtle jabs, the kind of remarks that left you second-guessing yourself. Are you sure that's a good idea? You're being a little dramatic, don't you think? Maybe you should just tone it down. He made you question your instincts, your passion, your fire, not because there was anything wrong with them, but because they terrified him. If he could make you doubt yourself, he could keep your light from burning too brightly. If he could make you shrink, he wouldn't have to grow. And then there was the avoidance. Oh, he was good at that, wasn't he? When things got too intense, when your fire became too much, he'd retreat, silent, distant, unavailable. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he couldn't handle the weight of your light. So he disappeared into his shadows, leaving you to wonder if you were the problem. But you weren't. His attempts to diminish you weren't about your faults. They were about his fear. Fear that your fire would consume the carefully curated version of himself he presented to the world. Fear that standing in your light would mean admitting his flaws and confronting his failures. Fear that he would have to change, and he wasn't ready for that. There's always a moment, isn't there? A moment when the fear becomes too much. For him, it was the day your fire demanded more than he could give. Maybe it was a confrontation, a betrayal, or just the quiet realization that he could never meet you where you stood. He chose the shadows that day. He chose his fear over your fire. He chose comfort over growth. And in that moment, everything became clear. He didn't leave because you weren't enough. He didn't walk away because you were too flawed or too complicated or too difficult to love. He left because loving you meant becoming more than he was. And he wasn't brave enough to take that step. His fear wasn't just about you. It was about him. It was about his inability to face the truth of who he was and who he could be. You didn't break him. You exposed him. And instead of rising to meet you, he ran. So don't you dare let his fear make you question your fire. Don't you dare let his shadows dim your light, because the truth is, he didn't lose you. You lost him. And that was the best thing that could have happened. When he left, it wasn't silence that followed. It was the roar of a fire denied, burning brighter and hotter in defiance of the darkness that tried to smother it. She didn't just watch him leave. She felt it. It wasn't an absence. It was an unraveling. Like pulling a single thread and realizing the whole fabric might come apart. He walked away, retreating into the shadows he clung to so desperately, and left her standing there, still burning, still radiant, but now questioning everything. She asked herself why. Over and over again, the same question tore through her. Why wasn't I enough? Why couldn't my light bring him out of his darkness? But that wasn't the real question, was it? The truth she would come to see was far more devastating and far more liberating. He didn't leave because she wasn't enough. He left because she was too much. Too much light, too much truth, too much fire. He left because standing beside her blaze required more courage than he could summon. And yet, knowing that didn't dull the sting. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical. It was the kind of heartbreak that grips your chest and makes breathing feel like a punishment. Nights stretched long, each one haunted by the echo of his retreating footsteps, each one a battlefield where she fought the creeping temptation to dim her fire just to make someone stay. But even in her darkest moments, her light flickered, refusing to extinguish completely. It wasn't gone. It was waiting for her to see that his escape wasn't her failure. It was his. And then something changed. Slowly at first, like embers reigniting, but then all at once, she realized the truth she hadn't been ready to see before. He wasn't her loss. He was her lesson. Every tear she cried became fuel for her fire. Every doubt became kindling. What he didn't understand, what he could never understand, was that her fire wasn't just hers. It came from something deeper, something eternal. She wasn't just light. She was resilience. And resilience doesn't fade. It grows. She rebuilt herself, not into someone new, but into someone more. Her light didn't just return. It grew brighter. Brighter because now it was unburdened. Brighter because now it wasn't being drained by someone who couldn't handle its intensity. She saw it clearly now. He wasn't a chapter in her story. He was a footnote, a reminder that not everyone deserves to stand in the warmth of her fire, and that's okay. Not everyone is built for it. His departure wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The spark that reignited her blaze, untainted and unrestrained. Yeah, her fire was never meant to be tamed, and it was never meant to illuminate someone unwilling to see. It was meant to burn fiercely and unapologetically for those brave enough to stand beside it. And him, he's still in the shadows, where it's safe. But her, she's a wildfire now, untouchable and unstoppable. And that is how it was always meant to be. Her fire wasn't just rekindled, it exploded into an inferno, one that no shadow could ever hope to smother. She didn't just heal, she rose. The pain that once threatened to consume her became the very fuel she needed to ascend. Every scar she bore became a badge of resilience, each one proof that she could survive anything, and not just survive, but thrive. The light she carried, once dimmed by self-doubt and his inability to stand beside it, now blazed brighter than ever. It wasn't a soft, gentle glow anymore. It was raw, unapologetic, and undeniable. She had transformed into a force that could no longer be ignored. People began to notice. Her presence commanded attention. Not because she sought it, but because her radiance was impossible to look away from. She became a beacon, her light guiding others who were lost in their own darkness. Women who had dimmed themselves for someone who couldn't rise to their level. Men who feared they would never find the courage to step into their own light. She inspired them all, not by soft encouragement, but by standing as living proof of what happens when you refuse to apologize for your power. Her light was no longer for him. It was for her. For the world, for those who could appreciate the beauty and ferocity of a woman unbound. And then there was him, watching, always watching, from the same shadows where he had sought refuge, but now those shadows felt colder, darker, more suffocating than ever before. He saw her now, not as the woman he left behind, but as the radiant force she had become. Every step she took was a reminder of what he couldn't handle, what he couldn't rise to meet, and it gnawed at him. His regret was a silent, lingering ache, one that followed him wherever he went. But here's the truth. His regret meant nothing, not to her, not anymore. She didn't need his validation, his apology, or his acknowledgement. His regret was a weight he would carry alone, a consequence of his choices, while she soared higher and brighter. Her light wasn't just hers anymore. It was a testament to every person who had ever been told they were too much, every soul that had been abandoned for daring to shine too brightly. And as her fire burned, fierce and eternal, one thing became clear. She would never again dim herself for anyone. She was never too much. He was simply too little. And now her fire is her freedom. The story doesn't end with his fear or even with his regret. It ends with her standing tall and untouchable, her light blazing against the horizon. She wasn't the problem. She never was. The problem was his refusal to grow, to face himself, to embrace what her light demanded of him. Her radiance wasn't a flaw. It was her strength. And his inability to hold space for it wasn't about her being too much. It was about him being unwilling to rise. Weakness always flees from power, and that's exactly what he did. He chose the comfort of darkness over the transformative power of her light. But here's the truth. She didn't dim, she didn't falter, and she didn't stop shining. Instead, she became a beacon of what it means to embrace your fire unapologetically. And in doing so, she proved that those who can't handle the heat were never meant to stand in her presence. Now, here's where this message is for you. If you've ever been told you're too much, if someone has ever tried to extinguish your light because it threatened their shadows, know this: the problem was never you. Your fire is not a burden, it's a gift. Stop apologizing for the way you shine. Stop shrinking to make others comfortable. The world doesn't need more dimmed lights. It needs women who burn so brightly that they illuminate paths for others. Let them fear your fire. Let them tremble at your strength. And when they can't stand the heat, let them walk away. But never, ever extinguish yourself for someone who doesn't know how to bask in your brilliance. So here's your choice. Be the fire that consumes. Be the light that blinds. Be the force that transforms. And let those who can't handle it burn in their own absence. Because the truth is undeniable. The world needs your fire.